This series has looked at the machine that is white terrorism. And if you've come this far, you might have a question. So, what do I do about it? What can I possibly do about a thing this old and a thing that built the borders and invented race and sits inside my own language and my own mirror? What can we do? It's not an easy answer, but there is an answer. And I also want to be careful not to tell you what to do, not because I have nothing to say about it. If you've been here for the past 10 episodes, you know I have plenty to say about this. But because the question, as you might be asking it, is broken, and it was broken before it reached you or me. What can I do to fix this is not a question, it's a trap. And it is the most reliable trap the structure has because it is designed to produce exactly one answer. To ask what you can do to fix a 500-year-old planetary machine, you look at the size of the thing and then you look at the size of your hands and you conclude correctly that nothing you can personally do will fix it. And then, having established that nothing can be done, you're released. You move on with your life and you go quiet. The structure of white terrorism does not need to defeat you. It only needs you and me to ask a question whose only honest answer is despair. And then it can rely on despair to do the rest. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to throw that question out. And I'm going to give you another question to replace it. And the difference between them is what the focus of this chapter is. The question is not what can I do to fix it? You cannot fix it. Nobody can fix it. No single person in the history of this thing has ever fixed it. And a promise of resolution at the end of any project that addresses it directly, including this podcast series, it would offer comfort, but not necessarily the truth. I think the right question is, what am I going to do even though I cannot fix it? That is a real question. It has real answers. And unlike the first one, it cannot be escaped by pointing at the size of the problem because it has already considered that the size of the problem is massive. Now, before we get to it, there are a couple of exits that I would like to close because I think that for somebody who's listening to this, and if you followed the series, you might reach for one of them because it ends with the machine running exactly as it was designed. The first exit I want to close is paralysis. And paralysis tends to show up as a type of humility. It sounds something like this: it's too big and it's too old and it's everywhere. You're one person and you alone cannot make a difference to it, not measurably, not in a way anyone can say single-handedly points at. So that is a correct diagnosis. So the conclusion is what is wrong, because from an accurate description of, say, your own sense of smallness, the person who feels paralyzed at the vastness of white terrorism and just the terror it has left in its wake might conclude or infer that nothing they do counts. It sounds modest, but it is not. It is a conclusion of someone who has decided that unless their action is decisive, it doesn't count, which is not humility. It functions on the premise that if you cannot be the one who ends it, then you would rather not be involved at all. And it produces the same outcome as agreeing with the machine. The machinery of white terrorism does not require your enthusiasm. It requires your compliance. And paralysis is a form of compliance that allows you to, in some weird way, keep your sense of self-respect. The second exit I'd like to close is heroism. And it is the same error as paralysis. It is the person who, knows all the facts, has all the knowledge, and they determine to be the person who dismantles it, who will fix the entire supply chain, who will decolonize the institution and save the world and the continent and everybody who has been sidelined or marginalized in it. I have watched this destroy so many people that I care for and respect. The scale of the ambition guarantees the failure. And then the failure gets read as a personal inadequacy rather than a proof that one person was never the right unit for the job. And then sometimes what happens is the person who ends up wanting to change everything actually ends up doing nothing at all. Heroism and paralysis are not necessarily opposites in this context. They are the same type of error, the belief that the individual is the unit of change, arriving essentially at two speeds. The third exit is the newest and the most flattering. And a lot of people who are engaged in this work will have taken it at least once, including myself. And it is a form of ideological purity or purity in general. It is the belief that the correct response to being implicated in a system is to make yourself clean of it. The ethical brand, the boycotting, the decolonized bookshelves, the reading list, the correct vocabulary, the carefully audited consumption, the language so scrupulously updated that no one can accuse you of anything. And some of this is genuinely good. I know I do it intentionally and I engage with my life intentionally. It is valuable, and I am not going to sneer at people trying to live decently inside a machine that they did not build. But one thing I think is important for us to also understand is that what purity achieves is minimal in a lot of situations. It turns a political problem into a personal one. It moves the work from the world where the machine actually operates and where it can actually be resisted into your own life, if that is the only type of action you were doing. So you purge yourself of the system without actually doing any work with what you were learning to ensure that you interrupt the machinery itself. Otherwise, you risk working where the machinery can actually not be reached, and you continue to improve yourself indefinitely without any form of action. So what happens in those situations is that you end up managing your own conduct, which is important. But at the same time, you have to also ask, am I confronting the structure? So if we close the three exits that I have mentioned, so this is paralysis, heroism, and purity, you are left, hopefully, standing exactly where I want you standing, which is inside the thing, unable to fix it, unwilling to be paralyzed, unable to purify your way out of it, and still obliged to decide what you were going to do. And to decide that, you need to know a number of things. I'm going to offer three. And you cannot know them in abstract. I think you have to know them about yourself in particular and precisely, and without flattery. You need to be able to self-interrogate without flinching. You need to be able to ask, who am I actually in this? Where am I standing? And what power do I actually have? I'm going to go first because I'm not going to ask you to do a thing that I have not done. And also because I've spent the last 10 episodes pointing at the systems and the structures, other people, and also myself. And I will continue that tradition here. So who am I in this? I hold a Nigerian citizenship and also a Norwegian citizenship. Nigeria was stripped, and it was stripped by the machine this series has described, and the theft is not historical to me. It is the reason Nigeria is poor in a way that is not natural and never was. It doesn't absorb Nigeria of the bad leadership and bad policies that continues that machine, but looking at it from what was stripped from it and what little was left for it to rebuild with. My Nigerian passport, for example, opens fewer than 50 countries. And sometimes when I decide to experiment and use it, I am searched, I am doubted, I am questioned, made to explain myself at borders where other people simply walk by. I am the extracted from. That is true, and I'm not going to soften it. But it is not the only thing that is true. I am also a beneficiary. My Norwegian passport is a strong one. It opens the world and I use it. And I'm not sorry to be able to travel at a moment's notice. When I'm in Norway, I live in a country whose wealth is not innocent, whose comfort is downstream of the same arrangements I'm essentially indicting in this series. And I chose that comfort with my eyes fully open, knowing precisely what it is built on. A fair number of my companies are in Norway, and I pay my taxes in Norway. I run companies inside a global economy that I have also spent this series calling a machine of extraction. I am paid in hard currency by the institutions that I diagnose, by corporations and by European institutions. And the money that sustains my life, also via my very, very hard work, also comes from inside the structure, not necessarily from outside it. Norway also offers privileges and stability in healthcare or in clean water, for example, for all. And when I am engaging in my work or engaging in my passion projects like this series and this podcast as a whole, I am doing it from within the system. And I also engage in English. English is my first language, the tongue I think in, the one I dream in, and which essentially I shared in the last episode is a system that functions inside of me. So who am I? Am not innocent and I am not only a victim. And I refuse either of those descriptions alone because they are more comfortable than the truth. I am both. I am harmed by this thing and I am carried by it at the same time, and the two do not cancel each other out. If I claimed only one harm, which nobody would deny me, I would get to be angry and blameless at once. That is the most attractive place available to me, and it would be a false place to be. And it would also mean using my real injury to avoid looking at my real complicity. That is what identity clarity costs. It costs you the version of yourself that you would have preferred to meet in situations and contexts like this. So again, this mirror still on me. Where am I standing in? Where is my feet? So let's look at it. I'm an economist. I run a handful of organizations. I'm writing books, speaking to rooms inside a global system with 5 centuries of momentum. Capital that moves in nanoseconds, states with armies, and an architecture that has already survived everyone who ever tried to bring it down. I'm not going to end it. Nothing I write, nothing I do, nothing I say will stop a boat from sinking off Lampedusa, from sinking in the ocean trying to make it over to Europe. Nothing I say in a keynote will get the cobalt out of a child's hand in DRC. The context I operate in is one where my individual leverage against the structure is functionally zero. And basically, any plan I make that depends on me personally moving the structure would fail. And people who set themselves impossible targets like this tend to give up entirely when they miss them. That is context clarity. It is not necessarily accepting defeat. It is measurement. You cannot decide what to do until you know where you are standing. So, mirror still on me. What power do I actually have? And it's not power over the machine. It's power about where I stand, which is a different thing and which is never, ever zero. And it is never going to be enough. I have the power to name, an example of which is this entire series. And naming it does not free anyone, but it does end that sense of pretense. And every structure this old has depended on not being named accurately. I have the power to decide who I work with and what I will say to them. And I have used it and I have lost work for it. And that is a real cost. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise or perform it as sacrifice. I also have the power to hire, which means that I control in a small way who gets to eat and who gets to build a life. And that is not a metaphor. It is the most concrete power most of us will ever hold. I have power to give away resources and to move it towards people the machine is currently processing. I have the power to tell the truth in rooms where the truth is costly, often very expensive, which is basically most rooms worth being in. I have the power to refuse to launder, which is one of the matters that I think is important and I will come back to later. And then mirror still on me, here is one more. I am paid by institutions I have spent a lot of my life, a lot of my work indicting. European institutions, large corporations, they do hire me to help them see themselves better. And I do take their money because I am ridiculously good at my job. So which is it? Am I inside the machine using the only leverage that has been available to me, saying the expensive thing to the people who can actually act on it? Or am I the most sophisticated laundering operation in, this system as well, which is the acceptable critic that they retain so they can point to me and say, look, we listen. And the honest answer I can give here is that it is both on different days in different rooms. I have walked out of contracts and I have stayed in ones I should have walked out of. I have said the thing, and I have, on occasion, said it just softly enough to be invited back. I'm not going to resolve this in front of you because it does not necessarily resolve, and any resolution I offer you here would be a form of performance. For me, it is a compromise of my working life, and I am telling you about it because if this episode asks you to look at your position, I also need to be willing to do the same. Now that we see our identity, our context, and our power clearly on its own does not necessarily fix anything. Every one of those actions can be small and local, and we still have to grapple that it is tiny inside the power and this structure that it might not necessarily make a huge dent. And yet, I make that decision to do it every day because this is a lifelong thing and we have to do it for the rest of our lives. And we have to do it because they count and because they accumulate and because they are what the work has always actually looked like from the inside. And I will also come back to this a bit later. And here I want to turn the mirror to you. So, your turn. You're not all standing in the same place. There are a diverse amount of people who listen to this podcast, and I am grateful for that. None of us really start at the same point, and we're never really on the same ground. Some of you who are listening to this would be among the ranked and the ones who this machine of white terrorism continues to organize negatively. And then some of you are beneficiaries sitting inside a comfort that was paid for elsewhere. And a great many of you are, like me, some compound of the two. And the first work is to find out which you are honestly, without the flattery of imagining yourself cleaner or more injured than you are. So if you're a beneficiary of this thing and you hold, say, a strong passport and you were born inside wealth, you most certainly are. And then the temptation available to you is guilt. It's important to note that the discomfort you're feeling is not the problem. It is information. It is accurate. And if you are feeling nothing, then that would be a completely different kettle of fish. The problem is guilt as a destination, guilt as a place where you settle and stay, because guilt as a terminal state is an emotion that the structure can absorb indefinitely, and it costs the machine nothing because it does not interrupt it. A guilty beneficiary who changes nothing and a comfortable beneficiary who changes nothing produce identical outcomes in the world. And the guilty one is arguably in more danger because guilt is exhausting and people flee what exhausts them. So it converts reliably over months or a year or two into avoidance and then into a form of resentment, of feeling like you were made to feel it. Feeling bad is not a contribution. It is the beginning of one, perhaps, and only and really only if it moves. What is required of you is not your emotion. It is your position, the thing that you actually hold, the room you are actually in the decisions that actually crosses your desk. You did not build this. And that is correct. You are not guilty of building this. You are, however, standing inside it, and it is currently running through you. And that is not a moral accusation. It is a description. And what you do about the thing that is running through you is the question I am asking you here. So for those who are marginalized and ranked, and the machine was built to sort you, and it did, then the temptation available to you is different. It is more subtle, and it has a tendency of looking like justice. It is to believe that being harmed by the structure means you cannot also operate it. Episode 9 in the series was clear, and I'm also not going to soften it here. The African elites who emptied the treasuries are not whites. The looting is real and ongoing. The hands are ours. And the fact that we were robbed first does not make us incapable of robbing. It only makes us more comfortable to rationalize and explain it. Being harmed and being injured is not the same as being innocent. It is not a moral credit line you can draw against. Everything I've just said to those who are beneficiaries about positionality applies also to you. And on top of it, there is a further and harder task that is yours alone, which is essentially what I discussed in the last episode on coloniality. The excavation, the ranking that was installed inside of you, which nobody else can dig out of you, and which will still be in there for the rest of your life. And then there's a compound, which is essentially most of us, and certainly me, and for whom the work is simply both at once without the relief of either. You do not get to spend your injury and you do not get to disown your benefit. You have to hold both, and you have to act from inside the holding of both realities. Wherever you are, the questions are essentially the same as I did ask earlier, and I will name them now again. So, identity clarity is the first. Who are you actually in this? This is not who you prefer to be, and not the version that is easiest to live with. Are you the one the machine takes from, the one it pays, or both at once? So let's look at context clarity, which is the second. What are you actually standing in? Where are you? How large is this system? How small is your position inside it? And what can a person in your position genuinely reach? If you answer that one incorrectly in either direction, you will either do nothing because you think you are powerless, or exhaust yourself on a target you were never going to be able to move alone. Power clarity is the third. What power do you actually have? Not power over the structure, which you do not, many of us don't, and you will not, many of us won't. But power based on where you stand in the decisions that actually reach your desk, which is never nothing and never enough, like in my case, and which is different for every person listening to this. Those three questions are essentially the only question in this chapter that points back at you and asks you to hold a mirror up to yourself. And I pose this not as rhetorical questions for you who are interested in this discourse. Answer them as best as you can, not in the abstract and not about people in general, but about the specific life that you are living in this specific week that you are listening to this. Name the room you were in most recently where something passed that should not have. Name the thing you signed or approved or forwarded or stayed silent about. Name what it would have cost you to refuse in money, in standing, in the meeting going badly, in safety. And then look at that number honestly and ask whether it was actually more than you could afford or simply more than you were willing to pay. That is the entire exercise. It takes 10 minutes and almost none of us really do it because the answers are specific and the specificity is the point. And a structure this large has always been most safely discussed in general terms. So the instruction I can give you here, if I may, is stop laundering it. That is the ask. Every structure this large runs on a vast number of small consents, most of them so ordinary that the people giving them do not experience them as consent at all. The bank that agrees not to look where the money came from, the minister who signs, the buyer of the phone who does not check the mine, the person who shops at a fast fashion brand or mass-produced product rather than supporting ethical businesses, the journalist who calls it a tragedy rather than a policy, the professor who teaches it as history and stops before really engaging how it continues to organize the present. The manager who runs the process that filters out the foreign name. The colleague who hears the thing said at the meeting and lets it pass because this is not the hill and it is never the hill. None of these people believe they are operating a machine. Each of them is doing something small and ordinary and reasonable and locally defensible. And each of them is a hand the structure has successfully recruited And this is the deepest thing that I can tell you in this episode. The machine does not run on monsters. It ran out of monsters a long time ago. It runs on ordinary people doing ordinary jobs and declining to look at what the job is for. Coloniality made the whole arrangement feel like weather, like gravity. And you cannot be complicit in gravity. And that is how the structure is designed. But it is important that we recognize that the system does not exist outside of us. We are the system. We make up the culture to varying degrees of power, which makes us complicit in some way, also in varying degrees. So refuse the small consent wherever it lands on you. It will land in form of something so mundane that refusing it may feel disproportionate and embarrassing, and sometimes maybe even career limiting. This is exactly how you will know you have found it. And then use the power you actually have in the places you actually stand, at the scale you actually operate, the hiring decision, the contract you do not sign, the clients you do not take, the curriculum you rewrite, the vote, the money, the room where you say the expensive thing out loud because you can afford it. But please only say it if it does not put your life or your livelihood in serious or brutal risk. It also shows up as the name you insist on using when everyone else has agreed to use a softer one. This is why we have to call this thing white terrorism. And yet, I must also note, I have described the room, and not everyone in that room has a desk. Responsibility differs and varies, and power differs and varies. Everything I have listed, the clients, the curriculum, the hiring decision, the contract, assumes a person with something to withhold. And a great many of people have nothing of that sort. If you are poor or in a precarious situation, or if you do not have the right documents to live safely in a country, or if you're working three jobs inside the very supply chain this series has been indicting, your consent is not required. And an instruction to refuse the small consent is an instruction that I have addressed to other people. I am not going to hand somebody who is already struggling a duty that you cannot realistically discharge. I think there is something harmful when we have this empowerment speak and responsibility speak without taking account for the reality and the ground that people actually stand on. Sometimes the ground is firm and stable, and for a great many of us, the ground is wobbly. So I want to be very clear about who I'm asking what. And the more power you hold, the more the refusal is required of you. And the ask scales with position, which is the opposite of how responsibility is usually distributed in the world. The person with the power to sign carries more responsibility than the person who cannot sign. And if you're the one being processed rather than the one who has to sign, then the work is not refusal because you have not been offered anything to refuse. So perhaps the ask here is what it has always been for people with no individual leverage. And then we have to look at the collective kind of leverage. So the unions, the association, the strikes, the votes, the sheer inconvenient fact of many people who are supposed to be invisible declining at the same time because they choose to be visible. This is not a consolation prize, but it's important that we remember that it is the mechanism that produced almost every gain in the record, and it was never invented by people with the desks. Now, to mitigate the risk that refusing the small consent might be flattened with a sense of purity, I want to be clear about what I mean. Purity changes what you consume, and that is valuable as well. But refusal changes what the structure can do. If you as an individual switch to an ethical coffee brand and you tell no one, you have changed your shopping and the plantation is unaffected. If you are the buyer of a company and you will not sign the contract with that plantation, the plantation has lost a customer and has to find another one, which costs it money and time. Yes, I'm using coffee to illustrate both acts. Only one of them, though, reached the plantation. The question to ask every time is not whether the act makes you feel better about yourself, It is whether the act made something harder for the structure to do. If nothing out there got harder for this machinery of white terrorism, you are managing in some sense your conscience, which I think is important, which also allows you rest and sleep. It does for me. But I think it's important to note that something out there has to get harder. If one person begins to disagree and it costs you something, then you are refusing. And it's important to not do it alone. Do it with other people, because everything I have talked about so far is individual and therefore small. And small is the beginning of impact. Nothing individual has ever moved a structure this big. The only thing that has ever moved a structure is a great many individuals moving together at once, deliberately, over time, in the same direction. And this is not about a personality trait, it is organization. And it is unglamorous, and it is slow, and it is full of exhausting moments. And yet, it is the only mechanism with a track record. It is not purity, it is not guilt. It is coordinated, sustained, and unfinished work. And as you think about this, keep in mind that the structure's most effective defense is not to fight your movement, it is to absorb it. It will offer you funding, a seat at the committee, a partnership, a job. It will hire the most promising individuals in the movement. And over a decade or so, a demand that was aimed at the structure becomes a department inside it. This is not a hypothetical reality, and it is not, say a defense or argument against anyone doing that work. It is the record. Some liberation movements have also become ruling parties that loot. Anti-racist demands has become a training model with a completion certificate. The people who fought for independence, as I think episode 9 showed, produced the class that now banks the country's wealth in some capacity in the UK, in London. And I'm not standing outside this one either, because I am sometimes the person the institution hires, and the institution is not always confused about why it is hiring me. Absorption is what a mature structure does instead of repression, because absorption is often cheaper and it works better, and it leaves everyone feeling like though progress has been made. Now, knowing that does not excuse you from organizing, because there is no other mechanism and there has never been. It arms you inside it. It means you watch the moment the demand becomes a program and the programs become a job and the job becomes the point. It means you keep asking the only question that survives absorption, which is not whether you're being heard, but whether anything has actually become harder for the structure to do. And it means you accept that some of what you build will be absorbed, and you still build it anyway, because the alternative is to build nothing at all in case it one day is co-opted. And that again is a form of paralysis. And here's the thing we also have to accept. You are probably not going to see this work finished. The structure is older than both of us, and it is entirely possible that it outlives us. And a life spent working against it will very likely be a life that ends with the thing still standing, the account still open, the work handed on unfinished to the people whose name you will never know. And yet, here's a fact. Change movement works. Not quickly, definitely not quickly enough, and certainly not neatly, and almost never in the lifetime of the people doing it, and never in a way that the winners are told that it worked, but it works. And I have to be exact about what's winning against this thing looks like, because the trade in human beings did not end because traders repented. It was ended because people organized against it for decades and would not stop. And most of them died with the ship still sailing. But also, if you followed the series, I believe episode 6, you would already know that slavery also did not really end. It changed clothes, and the plantation became the prisons and the depth infrastructure and the supply chain. The former empires did not dissolve themselves. They were pushed out at enormous cost by people who spent their whole lives on it. And in the previous episode, I put forward that empire did not leave. It installed itself in the language and in the mirror and in how people see themselves, and it stayed inside the mind. The apartheid state was broken over 40 years by people who went to their graves while it still stood and functioned. And the wealth in South Africa is still distributed almost exactly as apartheid arranged it. I'm not going to pretend like these were clean victories. What they were was real. The ships did stop sailing. The flags did come down. The laws did fall. Millions of people live differently because of it. And their descendants are alive and free in ways they wouldn't have been. And the machine was forced every single time to abandon a position it had held for centuries and to build something more expensive and more disguised in its place. In my opinion, that is what winning against the structure disadaptive looks like. It's not about abolition or attrition. You do not kill it, at least not yet. You take ground from it. You make it costly. You force it to change form, and each form is weaker than the last because it has to hide, and a thing that has to hide has already lost the argument and the war, even while it is still winning the battle. That is a record. It is not triumphant and it is still valuable. And anyone who tries to tell you that it is one or the other is trying to sell you something. The structure was designed, it was built by particular people out of particular decisions on particular days, which is the whole reason it can be seen and named at all. And anything that is designed can be redesigned. That is my position. The better world does not arrive on its own, and it is not owed to anyone, and it will not make itself. It gets built the same way this one did, by ordinary people making ordinary decisions day after day in rooms nobody is watching, only pointed in the other direction. The machine runs on small consents. So does the alternative. That is the symmetry, and it is the arguments. Now, this is the 11th episode of a series on renaming white terrorism as white terrorism. If you've followed up till now, you know it is hard to unknow the terror that was inflicted in the world and continues to be inflicted in the world. You cannot unknow the graves or the boats or the invention and the weaponization of race or the ranking sitting inside our own heads through coloniality. And a person who knows what this is and continues to launder it has taken a position, whether or not they admit to taking that position consciously or unconsciously. There is no neutral seat in the room. There never was. If you've followed this series or know anything about this discourse, then you cannot claim that you do not know. Everything we do is a choice, including the choice to do nothing. And sometimes that is the right choice. But it is important to understand that the choice to do nothing is not the absence of a position. It is the most common way the machine keeps running. So this is why I said in the beginning that I cannot really tell you what to do, but I can tell you to find who you are in it. Find where you are standing. Find out the power you actually hold, and then use it in the small and unglamorous and manual labor way where you stand alongside other people, knowing that it absolutely counts and it absolutely matters, and you might not be there when it pays to reap it. But do the work anyway, not because you will see the end of it, but because it works and because it is slow and because the people who came before you did exactly this with less and lost a lot more, and yet they won anyway. And they handed it to you and me unfinished, because that is the nature of this thing. And then it is our job to carry it as far as we can and hand it over again. This is not despair. Despair is a trap. This is the hope paired with action on the other side of it. So this is episode 11, and this is where I leave this one. This machine, you cannot fix this, and neither can I. We can't do it alone. Together, though, we have a chance. So we need to stop asking what we individually can do to fix it, because that question can easily lead to despair, because it's such a big machine to try to confront alone. And despair is exactly what this structure needs from us. So let's ask other questions instead. What am I going to do, given that I cannot fix it? Find out who you actually are in this system, where you are standing in, and what power you actually have to make even a fraction of a change. And then use it where you stand. Refuse the small consent that continues to feed the machine. And do it with other people if you can, because nothing else has ever worked. And this work will outlive many of us, but we do it anyway because it counts. All right. So this is the episode. I'd love to hear from you. Sit with it, argue with it. That's why we're here. And of course, if you like this kind of thinking, I have a newsletter called The Weekly Clarity, and all the information will be in the show notes. If this episode gave you something, send it to someone who needs to hear it. And as always, share it broadly. I'm Chisom. This is Overnight Wisdom, and I am so glad that you're here.